The practice of slavery dates back all the way to the first organized human settlements, although it took many forms that were often different than the American form of slavery that was based on perceived racial superiority. The first mentions of slavery occur in the codes of Ur-Nammu and Hammurabi, which included the rules that defined the enslaved versus the free and established regulations around the treatment of slaves living in Mesopotamia. These codes were written in 2100 BC and 1755 BC, respectively. Slaves in Mesopotamian society were either foreign prisoners of war or were citizens who had failed to pay their debts or had broken other laws as stipulated in the codes. Foreign slaves were used by the ancient Israelites for domestic and concubine work due to a relatively small population, although their tradition released all slaves after 7 years of servitude on a holiday known as the Jubilee. It is therefore that it is expected that slavery is discussed in the Old Testament of the Bible. The narrative goes that Adam and Eve had two sons, Cain and Abel, and in a bout of brotherly jealousy, Cain murdered Abel with a club, which serves as the origin story for the sins of murder and jealousy. To fill the void from their loss of Abel, Adam and Eve had a third son named Seth, followed by a daughter named Azra. Seth married his sister Azra, and they had a son named Enos and a daughter named Noam. Enos married Noam, and they had a son named Kenan and a daughter named Mualeth. Mualeleth, excuse me. Kenan Mualeleth married and had a son named Mahalalel, who thankfully at this point, with the population growing enough, was able to marry Dinah, someone who was not directly related to him. They had a son named Jared, who in turn had a son named Enoch, who purportedly ascended to heaven alive to learn special skills from God, a story which represents the beginning of writing and recorded history. Enoch had a son named Methuselah, who supposedly lived to be the oldest human in all of history, who in turn had a son named Lamech. Lamech fathered the patriarchal figure Noah, who is famous for being spoken to by God, who commanded him to construct a large boat known as an ark in preparation for a worldwide cataclysmic flood, a story which may represent one of the many near extinction events experienced by early humans. Before the flood, Noah married Imzerah and had three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, who all joined him on the ark with their wives. Once the flood had passed and the ark had beached itself high up in an unknown mountain range in the Middle East, it was up to Noah and his family to repopulate the world. Noah took up residence near the ark and went into pseudo retirement, with God commanding him to plant grapes and start a vineyard to produce wine, meaning that Noah is also the origin story for alcohol in the Abrahamic religions. When grapes were done being fermented, Noah and his family had a big feast, and he himself got drunk and went to go lie down in his own tent. The next part of the story is open to many interpretations, but the most well accepted one states that Ham was a jealous son who was nervous that his father would have more children and thus dilute his influence over future generations of offspring. So while Noah was passed out, he castrated him. The other two brothers were horrified at what Ham did, and when Noah realized what he had done, he cursed Ham's son Cush, angering Ham and causing him to relocate his family to Africa, serving as the origin story for the sub-Saharan African people. The fracturing of the family caused Japheth to move his family east, becoming the patriarch of Asian societies and also European ones, as his ancestors supposedly later migrated there through the Caucasus. Shem kept his family near Noah, who would later become the Jews, with the word Semite meaning descent of Shem. Cush therefore represents the first black person in the Bible and serves as the founder of the Cushite tribe located in modern-day Sudan. Many Christian Europeans later on would use the vagueness of this story to rationalize their enslavement of African people as part of the curse placed on Cush, even though nothing of the sort is mentioned in the Bible, and it is questionable whether the curse was even real, given that it came from Noah and not God. Additionally, slavery became present in Egypt in 1550 BC, although there the slavery tended to be Egyptian citizens giving themselves up to the pharaoh as slaves to have a place to live and a job to fulfill. This system worked for the pharaoh because as long as he controlled the narrow Nile Delta, all of the people were at his mercy, since they would quickly die on their own in the hot, dry Nubian desert. Prior to the powers of the free market, there was no easy way to organize mass labor without the use of slavery, and the Egyptians began to capture foreign laborers, possibly Jews, in order to construct enormous monuments such as the Great Pyramids of Giza, which boggles our minds today on how something of that magnitude could have been constructed so long ago. The secret lies in the power of free labor and expendability of human life that comes with having slaves. By 479 BC, slavery had become an integral part of the societies of the Greek city-states that were popping up along the Aegean Sea, both for Athens and Sparta. Sparta was an authoritarian state controlled by a military elite which ruled over a majority population consisting of slaves known as helots. The helots were basically peasants who were forced to farm and produce for Sparta and who would be executed if they failed to do so. Such fears were instilled annually when the Spartan army let their secret police division, known as the Crypteia, spend one night a year indiscriminately attacking and murdering helots, a practice which serves as the basis for the horror movie The Purge. The Crypteia, also acting as police, also served as a military training ground for young Spartan soldiers before they were deployed abroad in conflict. Interestingly, not much separated the helots and the soldiers, and young helots could choose to join the Crypteia and become soldiers for Sparta, which would grant them their freedom. In that regard, nobody in Sparta was free, and everyone was a slave to the greater good. In Athens, slaves made up around 25% of the population and included prisoners of war who completed manual labor, or Athenian citizens who became domestic servants after going into debt or becoming homeless. Many of the famous Athenian philosophers initially supported the idea of enslaving foreign peoples, believing that all of their peoples were inferior to the Greeks and that the Greeks had the obligation to lead these people, although these views began to change over time. Later, slaves also played a major role in the functioning of the Roman Empire, which largely based its system of slavery off the Greeks, albeit with a few differences. First, as the Roman Empire expanded in geography, they needed to employ an ever-growing list of professionals to help run the empire and turn to the conquered people who were already managing the territory to continue to rule, although now it empowered slaves who had no choice but to manage. The second major difference in Rome and slaves, other than the use of highly skilled slave labor, was that slaves would earn a salary just like other Romans for the work they did, which could be saved up and used to buy their freedom. For the Romans, slavery was a practical solution to facilitate a peaceful transfer of power for territories coming under their rule, and less about the use of free labor, although that was still heavily utilized by using criminals and debtors who had become enslaved. While slavery was less common in ancient Asia, slaves were present in China. In ancient China, there existed 5 punishments for crimes to maintain order: the tattooing of one's face with embarrassing remarks for crimes such as theft, the amputation of a foot for acts of disorder or treason, the cutting off of a female's nose, known as a rhinotomy, or the castration of males, both for sexual crimes and death by drawing and quartering by chariot or by boiling alive for the most egregious offenders. Men who had been castrated were known as eunuchs, who then became slaves to the emperor and worked in the royal palace at some level of personal assistance or advisory. The close access to the godlike emperor meant that becoming a eunuch was sort of a second chance after the embarrassment of their castration or crime, and many eunuchs went on to become very influential, to the point some men began trying to self-castrate in order to land the job, leading to the emperor having to ban that practice. Following the fall of the Western Roman Empire and the Christianization of the Eastern into the Byzantine Empire meant that the practice of slavery was no longer in line with the teachings of Jesus, and the practice fell largely out of use on continental Europe. The growing Islamic world became the center for the slave trade, where Berbers and other North Africans would be enslaved and distributed throughout the Arab world in the trans-Saharan slave trade. One rule of Islam states that you cannot enslave a fellow Muslim, so this served as a major impetus in converting the people of North Africa in order to avoid enslavement. During the Crusades, it was common for large numbers of defeated Christian crusaders to be captured and forced into slavery, as well as the captures of Europeans sailing in the Mediterranean and taking them captive back to Africa in the Barbary slave trade. One of the most bewildering instances of a mass enslavement of Christians occurred during the failed and unsanctioned Children's Crusade in 1212, when a child in Germany named Nicholas claimed to have a vision from God that told him to raise up a group of 30,000 children to march on Jerusalem and peacefully convert the ruling Muslims into Christianity through the power of love. Against the pleas of the Pope, a massive movement of radicalized children formed as Nicholas marched and preached across the Rhineland, and the band of children headed south to France, where they boarded a ship offered by some merchants who, unbeknownst to the children, had just sold them into a lifetime of slavery in North Africa. Many of these child slaves would go on to form the Mamluk forces, which were non-Arab slaves who were tasked with being soldiers and mercenaries. The Arabs had always relied on support from outside forces to staff their military, so a Mamluk was a slave primarily as an efficient form of forced military training imposed on non-Arabs to satisfy a recruiting shortfall. The Mamluk system was set up by Sultan Saladin, who founded the Ayyubid Caliphate, which had its power situated in Egypt. In 1240, al-Salih became sultan, and he massed up a large Mamluk army to serve as his own private army, allegiant only to him. In 1249, during the Seventh Crusade, the united forces of the Mongols and Crusaders were able to push back the Ayyubids to Egypt, but the Mamluks heroically defended the heart of the caliphate and repelled the Crusaders. Al-Salih was sick, however, and the stress put him over the edge, and he passed away and was replaced by his son, Turan Shah. Turan Shah did not trust or respect the Mamluks like his father, and he instantly set out by dividing them and trying to purge their ranks. In 1250, the Mamluks revolted and executed Turan Shah, beginning the Mamluk Sultanate, which would see the former slaves take control of the entirety of Ayyubid territory, beating back a Mongol invasion and controlling the Middle East until they slowly crumbled due to internal divisions, allowing for the Ottoman Turks to step in and take their place. In 1453, Constantinople, the capital of Byzantium, fell to the Ottomans, who in turn enslaved 40,000 Byzantine citizens, beginning the Ottoman practice of devshirme, where young Christian boys would be taken from their homes and converted to Islam and trained as highly skilled soldiers known as janissaries, a practice which definitely seems to be a continuation of the previous Mamluk system of using the slavery of foreign youth to train them into brainwashed super soldiers. The discovery of North American gold fields in the 1490s caused a collapse in the West African gold trade, and the emperors of many West African empires turned to the trade of slaves to replace the lost revenue. The strongest African kingdoms existed on the coasts, and these kingdoms would raid the African interior and imprison people of other tribes and bring them to the coast to trade with European traders in exchange for finished goods, primarily guns. One of the first kingdoms to begin trading slaves with the Portuguese was the Kingdom of Congo, which already had a long history of cultural slavery, which was like the forms of slavery seen elsewhere in the world, and they even had slave markets set up and ready to go. Portugal and Spain would buy massive amounts of slaves from the Congo and ship them to South America and the Caribbean to mine gold and farm, tasks that could not be completed by enslaved indigenous people, since virtually all of them had died after contact with European diseases. As the European powers added colonial territories in the Western Hemisphere, the demand for slaves increased wherever intensive plantation-based agriculture was established, with France and Britain joining in on the trade and bringing fresh waves of slaves from West Africa to North America. The African slaves would be loaded on massive slave ships, which could hold up to 500 people, were crammed in head to toe, shackled down while lying in horrible conditions, with only about half making the journey to the Americas alive. The trade of slaves would make up 1/3 parts of the so-called triangular trade, which would see the raw materials produced by slave labor in the Americas be shipped to Europe and to be manufactured into finished goods, with some of these finished goods being used to buy more slaves and continue the process. The slave portion of the trade was called the Middle Passage, which ultimately saw the passage of 12 million enslaved Africans to the Americas. This trade of Africans with Europeans for economic purposes began the concept of chattel slavery, where a slave is reduced to an asset at the same level as a piece of machinery that can be bought and sold, has a market price, and may depreciate over time with use. The European managers of the South American and Caribbean plantations, and to a lesser extent plantation owners in Florida and coastal South Carolina, did not see themselves as long-term residents of the land, but rather short-term managers who would exploit the slave labor to get rich quick and then return to Europe with their newfound wealth. This meant that they often did not bring their families across the Atlantic with them, so the whites were always greatly outnumbered by the black slaves. The plantation owners used brutal intimidation tactics and punishments to keep the slaves in line and from rebelling, something that began the deep distrust and racism shown towards Africans by Europeans. No longer did Europeans see blacks as equals who happened to have excess labor in the form of slaves, but rather inferiors who must always be commanded and controlled. Many of these plantation owners were Christians, so they would turn to the passages like the one about Ham discussed earlier to justify their behavior and denigrate the idea of a black person until they were no longer a person at all. Attitudes regarding slavery among Europeans began to change, however, and in 1807, the British Empire outlawed the slave trade so that their economy could better fit into the ideals of the newly adopted capitalist model, as free market of labor. The United States Constitution itself stipulated the expiration of the slave trade in 1808, which was included as a compromise between Northern and Southern framers. Many of the founding fathers of America didn't think slavery fit into their vision of a free democracy, but nonetheless caved to the demands of Southern representatives, partially due to the fact that the incentives of capitalism had not yet really caught on in America. The British did a 180 and began a global effort to eradicate the slave trade by using the power of their navy to chase and catch slave ships and free their captives. It was around this time that American inventor Eli Whitney's cotton gin was just catching on, something that would revolutionize the American cotton business and revitalize the need for slave labor to fulfill the ensuing increases in cotton production. While slavery had been on the decades-long decline in the United States and was actually expected to fizzle out in just like in other European dominated societies, instead saw a major uptick in its demand. Because the slave trade had now been abolished, existing slaves were even more rare and began to be treated even more inhumanely, often forcing slaves to raise large families that would be in turn broken up and sold as in crafty business transactions. By the time of the outbreak of the American Civil War in the 1860s, the northern states were, by all means, a miniature version of capitalist Britain, complete with its many productive textile mills. Although they relied on southern cotton to produce their fabrics, many northerners still believed slavery was incompatible with their Christian or capitalist beliefs and were willing to go to war over the issue. After the Union prevailed, the 13th Amendment was passed in 1865, illegalizing slavery in the U.S. The last country in the Western Hemisphere to outlaw slavery was Brazil in 1888, who by the end of the slave trade had imported 40% of all African slaves brought across the Atlantic. Ironically, beginning in the 1870s, the refusal of various African kingdoms to stop the local trade of slaves convinced the British to invade under the pretense of setting up a more civilized government, and this line of thinking began the scramble for Africa. In 1981, the Islamic Republic of Mauritania officially became the last country in the world to ban slavery. However, in 2019, there still is approximately 40 million people worldwide that are enslaved, 26% of them being children, and about half of the people enslaved around the world are working in forced labor, and the other half have been forced into sexual slavery.